We are talking The Pale Door. This one is directed by Aaran B. Kuntz, who also co-wrote this. And this is a Western horror movie, and it focuses on this kind of group of outlaws, this gang of criminals. And within that gang, there are two brothers, an older brother who is kind of the leader of the gang, and the younger brother who is really not a criminal. He's not actually part of the group, really. But he comes along on this kind of job, this last job that they're doing, because they're a man down. And so he's very experienced, very innocent, really. And they try to kind of rob this train, and they succeed. But they collect this casket, which they think is going to be filled with gold. But in actual fact, it has a young girl sort of bound and gagged within it. And she ultimately sort of says, take me back to my town and, you know, there'll be a reward, etc. And when they get there, there seems to be this kind of town full of women. However, they may have dark intent and they may well be witches. So that's your kind of your basic plot premise here. What do we think? I actually really enjoyed this movie. I do have a few kind of critiques as we'll come on to, but I've got to be honest with you, I had a lot of fun with this movie. This, to me, has a fun, kinetic energy through the film. Even though there's not loads of kind of big-scale action set pieces and things like that, I was invested in the movie for a number of reasons. So first of all, the characters. It's always a big thing with me. I have to have believable and or likeable characters. And even though these guys are criminals and we see them gun down, you know, marshals and police and all that sort of thing, sheriffs, you still root for at least most of them. And that's because I think that the movie does a good job here of making you feel like these certain characters within the kind of the gang are actually individuals. And we kind of feel that we get to know them a little bit before we kind of go on the kind of the main adventure. There are a couple of ones that are not as well developed, to be honest with you, but they are the ones that ultimately get, you know, taken out, at least first of all. But the majority, I would say, of the people involved in the gang, you feel are you know, real people, and they have complex relationships with one another. And you feel that there's a great element of trust within this gang, although there is a little bit of kind of friction in regards to different ideas within the gang. But it's kind of done subtlety. With subtlety. And that's another thing I would say this movie does have. It has some elements to it that are just kind of like sprinkled in that you may well miss, that are just sly little subtle things that it kind of mentions. And we have like the one black guy in the kind of like the group, and he kind of, we see him getting like washed. He's obviously got whip marks on his back and things like that. They don't make a big deal about it. It's kind of brought up again a little bit later on in the movie. But you kind of, okay, so he was a slave. It doesn't kind of have to spell it out for you. It shows you it. And we get, you know, the fact that one of the characters might be homosexual, but he can't say anything because obviously this is the kind of the Wild West at this point. So, you know, he sort of keeps it to himself, stuff like that. But again, they don't make a big deal about it. It's kind of mentioned in passing, and then it's just there. So subtle little kind of attention just to detail here about sort of character moments and that sort of thing, I thought was done very well for a kind of a lower budget B movie. I really enjoyed the bond between the kind of the two brothers, for example, where the older brother ultimately wants to kind of keep his younger brother out of this kind of like lifestyle and wants to kind of protect him, and is always kind of putting a brave face on him. And he doesn't kind of blame him and kind of get angry when it kind of things kind of maybe go a little bit wrong. And you kind of see how the younger brother really kind of depends on the older brother and stuff like that. I thought it was great character work in a kind of a you know, in a lower budget kind of ultimately straight to video horror and that sort of thing. But let's talk about the horror, because that isn't kind of forgotten about too. The movie will remind you of From Dusk Till Dawn in a lot of ways, because to a certain degree it follows the same template. We have a kind of some criminals, and we see them doing their kind of like their regular criminal things in the first kind of act of the movie, and then later on they're kind of going into a bar which is full of supernatural creatures. kind of follows the very same template to the original Dusk Till Dawn film in a lot of ways. It doesn't quite have that kind of that kind of Tarantino-esque kind of style to it, but nonetheless there is some similarities here, and especially when we get our antagonists turned into their more creature and sinister like appearances. Again, you'll be brought back to a Dusk Till Dawn, and you know, I think the witches here are interesting because we get a little bit. There's a pretty decent kind of flashback which I quite enjoyed, and I thought that was actually kind of filmed pretty well. So we learned some kind of history about the witches that actually points to somewhat of a larger mythology that is, again, it's only kind of hinted at, but we don't get the full picture here. But it's enough to kind of like get you to understand what's happening and stuff like that. The makeup effects are very good. There's some pretty violent deaths. The gore is not excessive, but it's still fairly gory in kind of places, and there are some painful death scenes that are that takes place on scene, and there's a reasonably high kind of body count as well. Okay, what doesn't work? A few things I have with this movie. The number one being, I think the first act, and this is before we get to the kind of like the witches part of the film, I gotta say, looks a little bit too modern. It looks like you're not fully buying that this is the kind of like the old west, the wild west. Things just look a little bit too clean. People are a little bit too clean cut. The dialogue, the language is used. Again, it just feels like sometimes you're looking at a B movie, and these kind of western scenery that we see are kind of like some type of like west theme park and stuff like that. You get away with that kind of stuff more when we get to the witches, because that's all kind of filmed at night, so you can kind of, you know, you don't really, it's hidden in a lot of ways. But when we see it in daylight, it just looks a little cheap. It looks a little too modern, as I've said. So there is that. As I've mentioned, there are a couple of the gang that do get a little bit underserved in regards to, you know, to characterization. But I think that, to be honest with you, is inevitable, because it's a relatively large gang. Acting wise, I gotta say, I thought for the most part it was pretty good, but there are a couple of not quite as good performances here. Again, they tend to be the smaller roles, but for the most part it was okay. But again, it's not going to win any awards. So the dialogue, again, is not tight. It's not really of its time. So you do feel it's maybe coming across as a little bit too modern. The other thing is as well, I feel that there should have been a little bit more meat on the bones in regards to the witches. One of the things I wasn't really sure about is when the jig is up, when these guys know what the situation is, and they ultimately start fighting back, they seem to be shooting and legitimately killing the witches. But I wasn't sure if they were actually killing them or not, because the witches seem to be running around not caring whether they're getting killed, but they seem to actually be getting killed. There was no kind of context in regards to, are they kind of just playing along? Are they going to all sort of rise up? Or because if they're not, they seem to be kind of running at guns with careless abandon, and you know, these outlaws end up taking a lot of them out. But it almost seems like it was planned that way. So again, I just think there needs to be a little bit more kind of work done on some story elements here, because it is missing certain things here and there in plot elements. But I still had a great time with this movie. A lot of that was driven from great characters. I thought the pacing was good, and I thought the horror elements were at least fun. Maybe not spooky. This movie doesn't really have a creepiness factor, but it has a kind of a fun monster movie feel to it. I'm going to give this one a 7 out of 10. Have you seen it? What did you think of it? Leave me a comment and I'll look forward to seeing you next time. Bye for now.